Hello, everybody. Brian H. Waters here. Queen P.R.
Hello, hello.
How you feeling?
I'm good.
Another 6HM project. I'm excited to do this with you. Let's tell everybody, I guess, how we met in a sense, even though we didn't meet with the intentions to get to where we are.
We met through podcasting, kind of. Everyone has a podcast these days, by the way. It's like crazy now. True. Like I feel like every day I see a new podcast being debuted.
Wait, before we get in there, I know I just went off script. How does that make you feel?
I think it's definitely kind of makes me want to step my game up a little bit more, just because the space is so oversaturated. Anyone can start a podcast, and that is a really great thing that the access is there. But at the same time, it kind of makes you think, quality wise, like quality over quantity. Like there's going to be so many, are we losing the art of podcasting? Like what made it so big at one point to where you know what I mean? Like it's bigger now than like radio. Major news are now recapping what celebrities are saying on podcasts. Right. So it leads to a lot of thought of just about where journalism and storytelling and like the audio space, like where it's going.
I'm glad you brought in journalism because I know that's something that you've been passionate about. Check out Breaking Through Glass Ceilings with Brian H. We did this in 2021. When we were just, when I had met you, I guess to say verbally, because I discovered your show one day scrolling through Twitter, and I came across Those Wrestling Girls. And I remember my first thought was, oh, wow, okay, 2 Black women talking wrestling. I like this.
Shout out to Krista B.
Yeah, shout out to Krista. At that time, I was in a space where had been doing Break It Down with Brian H. The Wrestling Realm, which we'll talk more about. I had created with, shout out to my brother, the real Dwayne Allen, in 2011 in college. And we couldn't do the show the way we wanted to. So I created Break It Down with Brian H. because I had that itch, right? And so I was always listening to a lot of people who were also podcasting, right? And I came across the show, and that's when we decided, I listened to it, and then almost a year later, I said, hey, you want to come on my show? Krista had been on earlier. So I learned that you wanted to do podcasting and, the whole origin. So y'all check it out there. But one of the things that I'm interested for people to know today was your drive to keep going. You mentioned that a lot of people been starting a podcast, and it can be discouraging. Let's be real, right? You do the show a year, 2 years, 3 years, then you see somebody else who may just started watching wrestling, or maybe just got into podcasting, no journalism degree, no media production background. All of a sudden, 10,000 subscribers, 20,000, 300,000 subscribers. But as we be candid here, that's what I love about 6HM is the ability and the fact that we are going to get candid. We're going to tell everybody. I say what to say. What made you keep your drive?
I think it's hard because so Those Wrestling Girls has been a podcast for 6 years now, and it's evolved in a lot of different ways. But I think when we started, it was more just learning that consistency was key. I'm a podcast listener. So Same. I kind of was like, as a podcast listener who had, at one point I had like 8 podcasts on my queue every week. And I would just knock them out at one point. And I was like, I want to build a loyal listener in our podcast the way I'm a loyal listener to some of my favorite podcasts. So I don't even know if this answers your question, but I knew that the fact that even podcasts, like, because there's so many, like you might be like super into, and then after, a couple years, you kind of like fall off, but like you still listen almost because you get that alert every Monday or every Wednesday or whenever that podcast debuts, that consistency of it. And I was like, okay, if I start a podcast, I definitely want to make sure that I'm as consistent as possible. And I've tried my best to do that. But because with social media and the internet as well, we were lucky enough to build a strong brand with TWG, those wrestling girls, that consistent content doesn't always have to be a podcast.
Yeah.
So I think just making sure that I'm always connecting with our audience on a consistent basis, I think is what keeps me going. And then also just wanting to constantly build my audience. Like the only way you can do that is to always be putting out the best content you can over and over and over and over again.
I'm glad you brought up sometimes because life gets in the way, right? And for instance, right now, we're sitting here. We got 2 microphones. We got an HD camera. We got a separate voice for audio. When Dwayne and I started, we had 1 camera, no microphone. And I'm going to go behind the curtain just a little bit. We have a monitor right now to see that we're like in focus. Thank you. As I sit there. But yeah, so we have that, right? Dwayne and I had a CRT television hooked up to the camera so that we could see. We got a ring light. We didn't have a ring light. We used lamps. But we was able to go every week. All of a sudden, in college, we buying microphones. What these while we was in college. We buy all the equipment, but didn't have the time. And keeping the brand consistent was community, Facebook's groups, between Facebook groups, between, Instagram wasn't really jumping like that, but Twitter, jumping in those hashtags. And that's one thing I think people should understand is it's not so much about building the audience as it is building a community.
Right. That's very important. And I have an interesting story about the very, 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 very first episode of those Wrestling Girls podcast. And why I say there's no perfect, you just, set a great example about how you and Dwayne created tons of content without having the perfect setup or equipment. But you kept going and you started anyway. So the very first episode of those Wrestling Girls is actually on Instagram TV. And I don't know if you remember when Instagram did a little, now Reels obviously took over, but at one point back in like 2017, 2018, Instagram put out like IGTV, and it was like billed to be the new YouTube. Like it was basically gonna like replace the content creation influencer space. So we were like, oh my god. And I was so always ready to hop on those new social media platforms, because you never know, this might be the platform you get 1 million followers because it's so new. And me and Krista are literally, because it was only vertical, we're literally sitting in like this hotel lobby like this, in the frame on one of our phones on IGTV. And that's our very first episode.
Wow.
And it was horrible when we look back on it. And it was like, and Krista actually just reminded me too that because I hated the name Those Wrestling Girls at first, I wanted us to continue brainstorming. Mm-hmm. She put that first video out with Those Wrestling Girls on it, so that basically like that locked in the name, like it's already out there kind of thing. So I was like, oh my god, I didn't even realize, like I forgot that happened so long ago. But that we finally just did it. After months of talking, we were like, let's just do it. And that kind of kicked off that, like, because it is a little infectious. Like once you start potting, like you just want to keep doing it. Yeah. So that's what eventually made us actually kick off TWG. And our first episode ended up being a recap of WWE Evolution, the first all women's pay-per-view in 2018. But
now, was y'all's always, so y'all came in, I don't want to say late, I'll say later, because nothing's late, right? But later than I did. And the reason why I'm bringing this up, because I want to know, were y'all always audio immediately? Like, were you automatically from day one? I know, let's talk about after IGTV. Were you automatically putting it on Apple, Spotify, etc.
Yes. So we were fortunate enough. We had, I guess, an investor at first that really believed in TWG. So we were able to have a studio membership. And a part of the shout out to Gotham Studio in Midtown, still going strong, growing by the day. A lot of other podcasters that you might Black wrestling podcasters, a lot of them film there, but they had a membership where you could go in, record, and they send you the video and the audio files. So we already just starting out, we had access to both. I always was just going to go towards audio because before I still am, but I used to be really shy and I just felt like video, like I just didn't think I was like for video content. So I was like, you know what, let's just stay audio.
You're a fine ass.
Thank you. So I was more gonna focus on video, and I didn't really know about other platforms like StreamYard and also like how easy it is to do these things. Right. And you think like these programs are expensive, or you're like, you think a YouTuber has like all this $1,000 equipment or something, and you realize like, oh shit, I can do this. So we were fortunate enough to always kind of have access to both. But I think with podcasting, it's the audio game. So even if you do post your podcast on YouTube, how's the audio quality? I think that's like really, really important.
Yeah, because and the reason why I asked is because for me, right, it was, like I said, 2011. Apple was a thing. I didn't know at the time how to get podcasts on Apple. It was all about
that was not easy at first.
Yeah, it was all about making your YouTube videos. So then, but many people may know I had a show with my cousin. This fool gets in trouble. Let's just call it for what it is. Me and Dwayne meet in school. Everybody know the story. Boom, wrestling conversation turns into the wrestling realm. And so we just kept that momentum. But then there was the Blog Talk Radio era. And during the Blog Talk Radio era, that's when I learned like, okay, because Blog Talk, once you put your show there, they would automatically take that RSS feed and send it to Apple. And I had a small time where that was the first time I got into like the podcast side. So that's how I learned, where it was like, okay, so, because people say you're a podcast, and my thought process in the early days of wrestling, well, we're not really a podcast because we're not on audio platforms. We're a YouTube, we're a wrestling talk show. That was the phrase. And then the pandemic happened. And then that's when it was like, okay, we got to get onto these podcast platforms. But, I know people come here for like resources. I'm glad we got to kind of share our story. You look at, just, turn around, boom, you see like those wrestling girls branding, you see the wrestling realm branding, being able to go from just essentially two friends who like wrestling that talk about wrestling to now let's start a podcast. And, I remember when I first came across y'all show and I was talking to Dwayne, I said, bro, you got to check out those wrestling girls. And that's all I said. So afterwards, he said, man, they remind me of the female us. And I was like, wow. And anybody know Dwayne? He ain't impressed by much. No, this cool. But he was like, nah. He said, like, their vibe, they like the way y'all click and play off of each other. There was always like y'all Austin Rock was me and his, I want to say sort of Brett Sean, but not necessarily, probably Hogan Macho Man. but it was, I know we don't have much time. We don't want to take up too much of our audience time, but what would you say has been one of the most rewarding things in creating a brand? Because I don't want to just limit those wrestling girls to a podcast, a brand, a community. You and I was able to get closer. And, like I said, we was able to collab on some things, And one thing I noticed about like your work ethic and bringing up the brand, I go back to December 2021. Me and you just happened to be just texting about something that happened on wrestling. And then you was like, do you want to create content? That was for Patreon. So you like opened up so many different avenues just from a thing called podcasting. What would you say has been like the most rewarding part? And the reason that when you look at the audience and somebody who's confused, like, should I not? What would you say to them on what's been so rewarding, a reason for them to take that and start there?
I think the biggest thing now, and I probably mentioned it before, is how a podcast is really just like one piece of a puzzle that creates a foundation for so much brand building. You know, like I never wanted to be on camera before. Like I honestly, to this day, I still feel like, should I be more of like, you know, I am a very much behind the scenes person, but podcasting allowed me to break out of my comfort zone, to break out of my shell. It allowed me to want to be better in so many different ways because, you know, you do 1 or 2 episodes, but you're like, okay, that's not good. Like I want the next episode to be better than the previous episode. What makes my favorite podcast? Like I want to put more work in. So I've learned about so many different programs and so many different ways of podcasting, and learning about you growing your YouTube channel, because that's a whole nother aspect of it, but it all feeds into creating better content and getting better and growing. So if someone is questioning whether or not they should start a podcast, like that is I feel like that's even a separate video, because I think there's so many questions I think you need to ask yourself before you do that. But it has been very rewarding. And it really depends on what your motives are. Like if you just want to express yourself, you know, even if you get those 2 or 3 listeners, like that might be rewarding for some people. You know what I mean? Like I want to build a career for myself, but also a big part of why we started 6HM was to also give back to that generation coming up behind us. So hopefully they get further along faster and don't make the same mistakes that we do. So I think just, you know, growing with the content, and then also just being able to give back, I think, is the most rewarding part.
Okay, and I would say this for anybody who's like wondering, okay, you know, when, should, how, why, find your why. Like you said, find your why. What's the reason? Then do it. Subscribe to 6HM, obviously, because we're going to give you a lot of what we learned, you know, and some mistakes. But part of what you'll get is, and the things that you'll get, it'll all be the same principles. Do it, be passionate about it. Be consistent with it, and expect to have mistakes, but pick up and keep going. Don't let your mistakes define you. I've been blessed to podcast and produce professionally. And what I mean professionally is, you know, for a big brand, and I've made mistakes. And you know, like I'm like, oh my goodness, the housework. Oh man, I messed up. I can't believe I left this in the edit and this, that, and the other. And now social media is killing me. Now, what am I going to do? Am I going to stop working?
No.
Then I ain't going to be.
You're going to be better that next time. You're going to like now, you know, make double check, triple check. But that only makes you a better producer at the end of the day.
Yeah, like one of the reasons you know, people say, well, we're looking at, like I'm always checking the audio because we doing this ourselves, right? So I remember a time where I didn't hit the record button on the audio. And that's the type of stuff that burns you.
You never forget it.
Yeah, when you mess up, you never forget. So expect those mess ups. Just don't try not to make the same mistake on a consistent basis. Learn from your mistakes. Any final thoughts?
No, I do want to make sure that we are providing as many resources to our listeners as possible. So drop your questions in the comments. Like if there's something particular about creating, producing, managing, hosting, marketing podcasts, let us know in the comments, because we'll make videos answering those questions, at least from what we've learned over the years, and things that we wish we would have done differently or better. So let us know like what information you'd like. And just go for it. Go for it.
Go for it. Go for it. Well, Queen PR, I enjoyed doing this with you.
Same, Brian H. Waters.
But y'all make sure you hit the subscribe button. Y'all know the particulars. Hit the subscribe button, share it with your friends.
You know what I did.
Yeah, pass along, help us in the algorithm. Yeah. And you know, like she said, if you have any comments, questions, or concerns, drop them in the comments, and we'll do our best to get back to you.
Yeah.
Soundstripe.